Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to North Shore Live Cooper's Corner. We're live this evening. This is November the 8th, 2017. I hope everyone is adjusting to the time schedule, daylight savings time. I mean, it's taking me a little while to be able to connect. Either you lose an hour or you gain an hour and you're too tired, or you're up at 4 in the morning or whatever. I hope you're all adjusting well and that everyone had a wonderful October 31st, which is Halloween, and that, we didn't just get stuck eating our own candy. The weather was beautiful. The day after was terrible, cold and rain, but Halloween evening was wonderful. This evening's program is just a heart stopper. We have with us as our guest Sue Baugh, and Sue is a writer, and she's going to tell the story of her family, her grandfather and her father, that were code breakers for the United States military, and decoding what the Japanese were sending to each other. Their actions were in the Manila area and the Philippines, and I don't want to get too far into it. I'd rather that Sue explain it. She's a wonderful human being and a wonderful family. I'm just so proud. I must shake your hand.
Thank you.
To have you on my program.
Okay.
We first connected with Sue with the American Legion 145 up here in Highland Park, and everyone was spellbound listening to you. There were 30 people in the room, and no one dared leave their seat. They were fearful that they would miss something that you were going to say. So without any further ado, I'm happy you're on the program, and delighted that you're going to let the public know for the first time. They don't know about this, but if you are a producer or a filmmaker, this woman has a wonderful story to tell about her wonderful family, patriots all, and so here we go.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sue, you've got it.
Thank you.
Sure.
This was a family story that until recently was not known very well. We had one story about my grandfather being a prisoner of war in the Philippines during World War II, and my dad being a code breaker for the U.S. Navy, and that was about it. We didn't know too much. Then I started digging into the story. I got more and more interested into it, and I found out the real story was astonishing. No one in our family had ever talked about this story. They were in the Philippines. They went through the occupation of the Japanese. They went through the Battle of the Philippines. No one said a word. So I put this story together as a way of recovering the history of my grandfather and my father during World War II. So if we could have the first slide. Okay, that's the title. And then the other slide. There we go. Now, my grandfather was Neville Richmond Baugh. He was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers engineer. My father ended up being Lieutenant Commander Charles Baugh in the United States Navy. He enlisted there, and both of them were extremely proud of their service. Okay, next one. Next slide. This is the Baugh family. My grandfather is the young man on the viewer's right, looking off into space. It was a missionary family. My great-grandfather, George Baugh, founded churches all over the world. In fact, my grandfather was born in Sri Lanka, and then they moved to Los Angeles. So in 1894, this was a photograph of the family. It's the only one we have of the entire family. Okay, next slide. Now, the Philippines, how did they end up in the Philippines? My grandfather, unlike his father, did not want to be in the church. did not want to be a missionary, so he joined the Army Corps of Engineers instead. The United States got the Philippines through the Spanish-American War, and they ended up owning the islands. So the islands were supposedly American territory. Unfortunately, no one had told the Philippine people this, and they were in the process of getting independence from Spain. So when the United States came, they expected the U.S. to help them gain independence. Instead, the United States took over the Philippines. Okay, the next slide. So we had the first Battle of Manila in 1901. It was a fierce fight. The Philippines did not give their country up easily. My grandfather went to fight in the war as part of the Army Corps of Engineers around 1903, and he ended up staying there. Okay, next slide. He married, after his first wife died, he married Pilar Maria Luisa de la Hoz, a Spanish descendant, and they had a family which included my father. And my father is the young man standing beside his dad in the white jacket. Now, going native at those days was considered absolutely being a traitor to your class. So this young man, Richmond Neville, was disowned by his family for marrying a native, what they considered a native woman. She was Spanish and part Tagalog. So this was the heritage of the family there. They had nowhere else to go. They stayed in the Philippines. Okay, next slide. My dad was kind of a sickly child, so they had him start swimming to try to build him up. He took to it like a fish, and he became the East Asian diving champion. Later on, we refurnished and refinished that silver cup for him and gave it to him for his 50th birthday. Okay, next one. This is the last photo of my dad and his father. They were did not have a good relationship. My grandfather was very hard on his boys, very much a disciplinarian, very much like Army discipline at home. I'm sure his sister, Ruby, made the two of them stand together to take this photo. This was right before my dad left the Philippines to go to college at USC. A friend of mine who saw this said, they look like two people waiting for a bus who don't know each other. But this was the last time they ever saw each other. Okay, next one. When the war broke out, my dad wanted to go to the Philippines desperately. Instead, he was sent to the code-breaking unit. Now, the code-breaking unit had a long history. In the 1930s, they had started watching Japan and monitoring Japan. They were very concerned about the buildup of the military in the Japanese nation. Okay, next one. This is a territory that the codebreakers had to listen to, this gigantic ocean. Now you have to remember, in those days, no computers, no GPS, no real radar. That came in a little bit later. So they had to listen to either ship-to-shore or ship-to-ship transmissions over the radio. They had to pick up these signals. This was a monumental task. Okay, next one. They had 3 stations. The main one was in Washington, D.C. That's the one my dad went to. The second one was in Oahu, Hawaii, called HYPO, and that was the one that was monitoring the Japanese activity. They were concerned about an attack, but not very concerned, unfortunately, at that point. The third one was in Corregidor in the Philippines, and that was in a tunnel on the Corregidor Island. It was built in the 30s and 40s, and my grandfather helped set the original fortifications on that island. Okay, next one. Now, these 2 men were the head of the code-breaking units. Joe Rockford had a very interesting history. He had become a Japanese fan. He went to Japan, he learned the language, he learned the culture. He actually met Yamamoto while he was in Japan. Lawrence Stafford was a straight-up military Navy person, and he ran a very tight ship. Both of them were brilliant code breakers. Okay? So decoding messages is a mind-numbing, tedious task, to say the least. At that time, you had to monitor everything and read everything by hand. So monitoring these traffic patterns, you had to have enough messages that you could detect patterns. And the patterns, you didn't even really need to know the language. All you had to do was detect certain patterns that would keep showing up. It really helped if you had math and language abilities, because then that made pattern detection a little easier. You had to have a great memory, because you might see a pattern that you saw 2 months ago, and you'd have to remember where that was. And then a really healthy dose of luck. So sometimes it was simply a matter of being in the right place at the right time. Okay? These are the Japanese codes that they were dealing with in the 30s and 40s, right up to Pearl Harbor and then through the war. So they partially broke 2 of the JN 25B and C. That was enough that they could decode some of the messages and the critical information. Purple code was broken. They found a machine that was sort of like the Enigma machine, and they could break that. The flag officer's code, they never broke it. So that one, they had to rely on the other messages to find out what was going on. Okay? So this is the Washington version of the code breaking. This is where my dad was. He moved there when the war broke out, he and my mom. The second one, go to the next one. This is the one in Oahu, Hawaii. This was in a basement. These poor people never saw the light of day. They sometimes would work straight through for 6 weeks at a time. They would eat there, they would sleep there. Occasionally they'd see daylight, but not much. Okay, next one. This is the Corregidor Island Tunnel. Again, a very, very restricted area, and you had to sit there for days on end. Now, a lot of the code breakers in Washington were women, and it was a woman who wrote one of the key codes for the Battle of Midway. Okay, next one. Again, just a reminder, this is the territory they had to monitor. So this is thousands of miles of ocean. And up in the corner you can see the Hawaiian Islands, how far away they are from everything. Okay? So in the build-up to the war, this is what the United States and Japanese military had on hand. The Japanese were ahead in the battleships, the U.S. Navy ahead in destroyers and submarines. But the aircraft carriers were the key. Here Japan was ahead of us. We had only 7 to their 10. So in actual fact, they had a crucial advantage going into the war. And the next one. Admiral Yamamoto, perhaps one of the most brilliant commanders that Japan has produced. He had visited the United States. He had seen the technical power and the manufacturing power of the United States. And he knew that any time Japan decided to go to war against the U.S., it was only a matter of time before they lost. But being a very strong military Japanese person, he absolutely wanted to support his country when they declared war. Okay? This was a new Japanese carrier. Now, it was bigger than the ones the U.S. had. It could carry more planes, and it had a longer reach. So they were already planning for long-distance attacks throughout the Pacific area. Okay? The reason the attack was such a surprise, one of the reasons, was the fact that they had redone and sort of overhauled the Japanese Navy so that what Joe Roquefort and the other military people knew about Japan's tactics was already out of date. Instead of the rote, by-the-book strategies that had been in the past, Yamamoto had adopted some of the American techniques and strategies. So he sent his carriers to Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, to attack the Hawaiian Islands from the north. Everyone was expecting the carriers to come from the south. Okay? So while they were readying for attack, the codebreakers were desperately trying to find out what was going on in the southern Pacific and in the areas around the Solomon Islands. Meanwhile, they were not picking up any radio messages from the carriers in the Aleutian Islands because they already knew what the plan was, and they were in radio silence and had been since November. There was no messages to pick up. So December 7th, when they struck, it was a complete and total surprise to the Hawaiian Islands. Next shot there. This is the magazine of the Arizona exploding. It sank the ship. The next. So within 7 hours, the Japanese attacked all of these countries simultaneously. It was one of the most brilliant coordinated attacks of the war, and it caught everyone by surprise. Okay? The U.S. declared war immediately, and the whole country was galvanized. Everyone was called up, or whoever could volunteer to go into the military. Okay. The Japanese invaded the Philippines in 41. By October of 42, they had the entire country. But it was not an easy victory for the Japanese by any means. Okay, next one. Two generals in charge of the military in the Philippines were MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, and Wainwright. Now MacArthur was the senior general, and he had so much information about the United States strategy and the United States tactical situation, they had to get him off the island. Unfortunately, he was terrified of flying. He hated flying, so they had to get him off by ship, which delayed almost by 6 weeks. He didn't get off just in the nick of time when the Japanese came in on the invasion. Wainwright stayed. He was captured by the Japanese and spent most of the war in a prisoner of war camp for officers. Okay, next. Here's where the definitive battles for the Philippines took place in terms of the Americans. My grandfather, at the age of 64, was called up back into service because he had helped create the Corregidor fortifications. So they sent him to Corregidor. The main forces were on Bataan and the island of Corregidor. Bataan was defeated, and the forces there surrendered. It was a combined Philippines and U.S. force. Corregidor the same, but Corregidor held out a little bit longer. Next slide. Corregidor is called the Rock. It's simply a massive fortification. It was at the entrance of the Manila Bay, so no Japanese could get in Manila Bay without capturing Corregidor, which made it absolutely crucial. The Japanese thought they could get it in 5 weeks. It took them 5 months, and they threw everything they had at this island. Okay, next one. Finally, in May, the artillery at Corregidor fell silent, and the Japanese captured the island. The people at Bataan had already been marched through a hellish jungle and were already in Manila in prisoner of war camps. Okay, the next. This is the photo taken by the Japanese of some 14,000 prisoners who surrendered. My grandfather is in this crowd somewhere. He was helping support the artillery and support the infantry for fighting. They had 75,000 Japanese attacking this island, and they were really angry that it had taken so long. Okay, next shot. There were 14,000 prisoners taken. They actually retook this photo, the Japanese, because they didn't like the way it looked. So they marched everyone back into the tunnel and then had them come out again so that they could take this photograph. Okay, next one. Now, because Corregidor had fallen, they could be taken in ships across the bay to Manila. The poor people who had marched from Bataan couldn't do this. So thousands died along the way for this. But the Corregidor survivors were taken directly across to Manila. Okay, next one. Manila was declared an open city by the Allies, which meant no country would bomb the city. And it was absolutely beautiful. It was called the Pearl of the Orient. It had a lot of Spanish architecture. It was very cultured. People were very proud of their city. So they were relieved to know that the Allies were not going to bomb the city, neither were the Japanese. So throughout the war, until the very end, there were no bombs that fell on this city. Okay, next. Camp O'Donnell. Now, the Japanese were completely unprepared for the amount of prisoners they had. They had no idea how to care for them, what to do with them. So they were held at a Camp O'Donnell near Manila. They first marched them through Manila to show the Asian superiority over the whites, and that the whites had surrendered to them, and so the Europeans and the Americans were inferior. The camp, they were held there for a while, but then they had to be moved to other prisoner of war camps, both in and outside Manila. Okay, the next one. The old Bilibid Hospital was turned into a prisoner of war camp. This was used mainly for the families of people who were captured, and conditions here were a little better, but they were still pretty bad. One of the things the Japanese did was, one of their strategies for dominating the population was using the tactic of starvation. So throughout the war, food was in very short supply for the Filipinos and for the Europeans and Americans there. The Japanese took all the food. They required the Filipinos to have gardens, and they took all the food. If you were hoarding food or if you were caught stealing food, you were shot immediately. Okay, next one. This is there were 3 Cabanatuan prisoner of war camps, 1, 2, and 3. My grandfather was at Cabanatuan 1. These were north of Manila, and they were pretty horrible. They were thrown together, makeshift huts at first. There was no sanitation, there was no water to speak of, and there was very little food. And in a tropical setting, this is a nightmare. They had thousands of flies and mosquitoes clustering around them. There was never a time when they were out of the sun, and the sun in the tropics is just burning. Especially for European skin, you would be sunburned very quickly. When people died, they were buried, but because of the tropical rains, the bodies would simply stick up out of the ground. So the stench must have been unimaginable. My grandfather was 64, 65, some 40 years older than most of the men in the camp. And he was also a fantastic musician. So what he did to try to organize the men and try to keep their morale up was he would form choir groups and choral groups and hold musical presentations to give them something to live for. And he did this throughout the time that he was at Cabanatuan. Okay, next slide. There are no photographs, there are very few photographs of the camps, but some of the men drew pictures of what was going on there. Now the Japanese Bushido code is you get your honor from battle, from victories, from your conduct as a warrior. If you're assigned to guard prisoners in a prisoner of war camp, there is no honor in this. So the Japanese were mostly really angry that they had to be these guards. In fact, the officers wouldn't even stay there. They would go to Manila and leave the enlisted men and the non-coms in charge of this. So there was no officer restraint for behavior. So the Japanese would simply beat people randomly. They would beat them because they didn't like the way they were walking, because they didn't bow enough. They would tie them up on stakes and leave them out in the sun. They would restrict their food, their water. There was very little medical treatment. So living in the camps was pretty much hell on earth. Next shot. This was a sketch of what was inside one of these buildings. There were no mattresses, there were no covers. Sometimes, especially in the tropics, your clothes rot off of you because a lot of them are cotton, and in the high heat and humidity, they simply fall apart. So a lot of the men had no clothing, or they would find towels, or the Filipinos, at great risk themselves, would throw food or clothing or things over the fence trying to help them. If the Filipinos had been caught, they were shot immediately. Okay, next one. This was the Japanese conquest by June of 1942. They had all of this territory. They had most of the islands. They had a good part of Manchuria and China. They had a lot of Indonesia. And this was the high point of their conquest. From this point, it began to turn. Okay, next slide. So my dad was in Washington, D.C. They were frantically trying to find out what the Japanese were going to do next. They had managed to find out that there was an abbreviation referring to Midway, AK. They continued to alter their codes, but the codebreakers had enough information and enough patterns they could continue to decode their information. And they had now faster communication between the Hawaiian Islands and Washington, D.C. So their communication was a lot quicker. Okay, next one. We were very fortunate to have these two admirals in charge of the Navy in the East and West Pacific. The High Command was wanting to be more conservative. The Japanese had just ripped through everyone, and they were wanting to just sort of, let's wait and see. Halsey and Nimitz were of the opinion that you take the war to the enemy. And so the two of them worked unofficially together. They would often send information or messages to each other that didn't include the High Command. And they agreed they needed to do this. Okay, next. So the Japanese wanted to capture this tiny little atoll, Midway, because it was a place for landing planes, and that could be a launching pad to either Hawaii or the west coast of the United States. So it was absolutely critical to find out what the Japanese were doing, where they were going to be. They had managed to decode enough of the Japanese messages to realize something was up. Something was up in the Pacific area near the Hawaiian Islands, but exactly what, they weren't sure. Okay, next slide. The big break came when they discovered the Japanese were asking for sea maps around the Hawaiian Islands. So now they had a good idea that their target was Midway. They decided if they couldn't quite decode the messages, let's get the enemy to tell us the story. So they sent out a false message saying that Midway was having problems with its water. Their water purification had broken down and they were short, they needed water. Immediately there was a flurry of messages back and forth among the carriers, among the Japanese, and they knew, bingo, we've got them. So they set a trap for Yamamoto and his aircraft carriers. Next slide. 6 carriers are steaming toward Midway, figuring they have the element of surprise. Unknown to them, U.S. carriers are already warming up their planes to attack. Next slide. It was the first naval battle in the history of the world where both ships never saw each other. This was a completely airborne attack. So because the U.S. had the first jump, they could immediately inflict a lot of damage on the Japanese carriers before their planes could even get in the air. They sank 4 out of the 6 carriers for Japan. The Navy never recovered. So they were badly defeated right at the height of their power and their conquest. They suffered an irreversible loss. Okay, next one. After that, they began the Battle of the Philippine Seas, because now they could start reclaiming the territory they'd lost to the Japanese. My dad at this point had told my mom, right before the Battle of Midway, that they had done it. And she asked him, "What did you do?" And he said, "I can't tell you." So we didn't know what he had done for years, because he was told afterwards never to speak of it, and he never did. He got a letter from Roosevelt, the whole team got a letter from President Roosevelt saying, "You know that thing you did that we can't talk about? Great job." So the president recognized the code-breaking group and their valuable contribution for the defeat of Midway, but he could never say exactly what it was they did. Okay, next slide. In the meantime, there was a general report on how dire conditions were in the Cabanatuan camps. So the Army decided in January of 1945 to lead a raid on the camps and liberate the prisoners that were left. Okay? Now these are what the prisoners of war looked like when they entered Cabanatuan in 1942. There were some news reporters there took a picture. The next slide shows you what they looked like at the end. There were only 500 remaining at Cabanatuan. The rest had been shipped out to Japan or died during this time. So there were only 500 remaining. These were the older ones, the ones who'd been sick, who were disabled or wounded. The rest of them were bound on hell ships to Japan as slave labor in the manufacturing plants there because Japan was short of manpower. Next slide. I managed to get a copy, and I'm not sure how this ended up in my hands, but this is my grandfather's last will and testament written at Cabanatuan 1, November. I'm sure he thought he was about to be killed or was going to die, and he wanted to make sure that his survivors understood what his wishes were. There were 3 witnesses, one of them from Dubuque, Iowa. The family is still there, and I'm hoping that I can talk to survivors there and see if they have any information about my grandfather. But this was his complete last will and testament. Next slide. This is the combined U.S.-Filipino Army that led the raid on the Cabanatuan camps. This is a great event in the Philippines. The anniversary of this is celebrated around Manila. And it was a lightning strike into the camps to liberate these men. Next slide. Unfortunately, my grandfather was not among them because he had been transferred mysteriously to Bilibid Hospital in Manila, so he was not released. In the meantime, the U.S. Army, as MacArthur had said it would, is returning to the Philippines in the southern islands in October. Okay, next one. So the U.S. Army began their invasion of the Philippines during this time, and the Japanese had decided they were going to show the American Army what it would be like to invade Japan. So the Battle of the Philippine Islands is one of the most severe, high-casualty battles of World War II. Next slide. The San Tomas POWs were liberated February 4th and 5th in 1945. The Army had reached Manila by then, certain battalions, and they liberated the San Tomas POWs. Next slide. This is what they look like. Nearly everyone in the Philippines had some similar resemblance to this because after 3 years of starvation, no one is going to be in good shape. The old Bilibid POW was liberated then. My grandfather was liberated on February 4th, and he was in this hospital, POW prison. The Japanese were going to make a stand there, and at the last minute, they decided not to, and they all left. Next slide. So here I found on the internet, and you can find incredible documents on the internet, was a liberation roster, and there was his name, Neville Baugh, and at that time he was considered a civilian, not military, which probably helped save his life. Okay, next one. This is a route from the old Bilibid prison to our Baugh family home, which is still there at 946 Hidalgo. It was about a mile from the camp, and so he was able to actually just be carted home very quickly after he was released to his daughters, my Aunt Ruby, my Aunt Carmen, who were there at the home and eagerly awaiting him. Next slide. Then the battle for Manila began. This was a fiercely fought battle. Door to door, building to building, block to block. The Japanese wanted to make sure they inflicted the highest number of casualties they could on both civilians and military. So every single block and foot of ground was fought over, and Manila was shelled to almost complete destruction. Next slide. This is one of the Japanese battalions. They brought in everything they could. They brought in armaments from the countryside. They brought in battalions from the countryside to try to defend Manila and just make it cost the U.S. Army as much as possible. Next slide. This is some of what it looks like. Unfortunately, today we have a similar news pictures from the Middle East. This is what happens when artillery pounds a city. It reduces everything to rubble. Next slide. The Filipino guerrillas, the Filipino people were so incredibly courageous during this war. They were among the best fighters in the U.S. Army combined Filipino battalions. And the U.S. Army had enormous respect for them. They fought side by side with the Americans, and they were proud to do so. And they also did everything they could to help the military and the prisoners of war. Next slide. These are enormous guns. Some of them are probably 5 to 10 20-inch shells, and they have a range of up to 2 to 3 miles. So you can imagine the power and the force they're delivered. Okay, next slide. This is what Manila looked like at the end when the Japanese finally left the city. It looked pretty much like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. There was hardly anything left standing in the main areas of the Philippines. Most of the people in this area fled to the surrounding hills where there were caves, and they could stay in them and stay out of the shelling. My family, part of my family, was in the caves as well. Next slide. This is an estimate, as well as they can tell, of the casualties and the number of civilians killed in Manila. The exact count is impossible to measure. This is the best estimates from the Army and some of the Red Cross people. By contrast, you can see Hiroshima and Nagasaki figures, the immediate blast deaths. So this was pretty high cost. Next slide. And one of the casualties was my grandfather. 1 week after liberation, he was out in the street going to visit friends of his, and he was killed by the artillery fire. His daughters were devastated. They had, for 3.5 years, they had tried desperately to get their father out of the camps and back to Manila. He had succeeded in doing so. He had survived the war, and then he was killed 1 week later. My dad received the Red Cross telegram saying he'd been liberated, and a week later he received the telegram saying he'd been killed. He was buried and remains there today in Manila, in the Philippines. He was 67, which is incredible. I do not know how he survived 2.5 years. Okay, next one. The only reason Japan surrendered was they were ordered to surrender. They were still fighting in August in the hill countries, in the small towns. So the Japanese imperial forces ordered their surrender, and the occupation was over. The Japanese were sent home. Next slide. The war memorials there, my dad got a chance to go back and visit the war memorials. The memorial at Corregidor is very powerful. They still have some of the artillery that was used as a memorial there. You can still see some of the fortifications. But this memorial here is just very beautiful. Next slide. This was a recent memorial, just in 1982, Cabanatuan War Memorial, recognizing the POW camps that were there and the suffering of the people who were in the camps and the Filipinos who died trying to help them survive that incredible experience. Next slide. This is a wall of casualties, and as you can see, the U.S. casualties, and then the Filipino wall is about 3 times longer. So there were far more Filipino casualties in the prisoner of war camps than American, but it was still a significant number who died in the camps. Next slide. One little memorial out in Crystal Lake, Illinois, my dad's marker. He was so proud of his Navy service. I think it was the high point of his life. and on his tombstone he wanted to have his service remembered. So this is, I go out every year and put a little flag on there. Next slide. So I'm commemorating not only my grandfather and my father, but all the people who fought and, sorry, died in this horrific war that the Japanese, I'm sure many of them didn't want to be there, didn't want to do what they were doing. We just wanted to be home. The Filipinos who fought, the Americans who fought. I don't think the Philippines has ever quite recovered from the severity and the destruction of the war. I think it has left a mark. It certainly left a mark on our family. Very proud of all the people in our family who were there and all the people who lived through that incredible experience. And that's our story.
Oh, Sue, this is just incredible.
Yeah.
I'm
I always
sorry
cry.
you have to go through this torture, but
No, it's
people
amazing.
wouldn't know unless you told the story.
Yeah.
And this is your family.
It's an incredible story of endurance. I mean, people really need these stories because they need to know who their people are, who they come from.
That's right.
Because the ability of my grandfather to use art to survive what was a completely hellish experience and dehumanizing experience, and to use his art, his music, to be able to survive that is so encouraging to those of us who are going through maybe difficult times, nothing like he went through. But just to know this history is in our family is so strengthening.
Such patriots, such unbelievable patriots.
Oh, my dad was so thrilled to be working in the Navy. He was a Naval Reserve officer. He went for 22 years, every weekend, once a month, and he just loved the Navy. He loved his service there. So to tell his story, and the fact I'm still trying to find out his service record. It's through Freedom of Information Act because it's all classified, and I'm hoping I can find out what his service was, or maybe have some of it declassified. I would love to know, because he was sent on a mysterious mission to Hawaii.
This yesterday would have been 73 years ago.
Right.
73 years ago, and you were able to find out some,
yes,
not all,
no,
of, you don't know about the secret mission.
No.
And if President Roosevelt hemmed and hawed about the thing,
he
whatever,
couldn't say.
No,
none
your
of them
father certainly
Yeah.
would not have said.
He, of that generation, I think, and I think this is true also for current generation, when they say they will not talk about,
They don't talk about
they
it.
do not talk about it.
Yeah.
Not a word. I would ask him, well, Dad, what'd you do? What stuff? Well,
Stuff.
what kind of stuff? I
Stuff.
can't say.
Yeah.
And that was it. Even when he came home and they had broken the code
Yeah.
enough to know that Midway was the target, all he could say to my mom was, we did it.
We did it.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yes.
Just, I have goosebumps. From when you gave this report to the American Legion, and we sat there watching, to now, I could hardly speak. I'm just choked up because this is incredible. Generations have come and gone and come and
Yes.
gone. 73 years later,
Yeah.
and people are not really aware of the code breakers. There
No.
were code breakers.
Right,
Not
and
what
many
you,
of them were women.
but not what you see like in the movies.
No, it's
oh,
tedious
it-
beyond belief.
But this is the real McCoy.
Yes. In fact,
is-
there's even the story of the military band attached to the Arizona. When the battleship went down, the military band was out of a job, basically. Well, Joe Rockford said, give them to me, because they're musicians.
Yeah.
They know patterns.
Patterns,
and they
yeah.
turned out to be excellent code breakers.
Oh, holy cow.
So the
look at
military
that.
band
They used the band.
was in the code breakers in
Oh,
Hawaii.
that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Because they had to have good memories, which musicians do, and they have to be able to detect the patterns out of all of the signals, which musicians can do.
Oh, sure.
So that's what they did.
And the pictures are incredible. What you have, those pictures are just incredible.
I can understand when I was going through the pictures, because I had never known. Our history books don't begin to explain how savage that battle was for the Philippines. It was probably comparable to, say, the Battle of the Bulge, and how vicious that was.
The 38th parallel.
Yes.
Oh.
It was like that. It was that intense, because the Japanese were not going to give easily any foot of ground.
You know, they said, not too many years ago, they were still finding Japanese in caves.
Yes.
They were not going to surrender because it was a blight on their honor that they would surrender.
Absolutely.
They didn't care about the Geneva Convention.
No.
They were going to fight to the death.
That was one of the things that made the camp so terrible, was the Japanese with the Bushido Code. If you fight the emperor, you are not a captive opponent with an army. You're not a military prisoner. You're a criminal. So you have no rights.
Criminal.
And that was the way they regarded all the people that fought against them throughout Asia.
And in the American way is, if you surrender, they would have felt that they would have had the
Geneva Accords.
Geneva Convention.
Yes.
Their men would have been taken care of or whatever. But the Japanese looked upon it as cowardly.
It was, you had no honor when you surrendered. So right away you were inferior there.
Yeah.
But you were also a criminal for fighting against the emperor. So therefore they felt free to do anything to you, which they did. And reading some of the reports that were declassified about conditions in the camp, it takes a pretty strong stomach to read them. I mean, really strong. So, and this was true throughout Asia. Now, I was very fortunate to talk to a 92-year-old veteran who had been with MacArthur's army throughout the entire Philippine occupation and recovery of the Philippines. He said they made a very clear distinction between the Japanese military, they called the Japs, and the Japanese people. He said, very, very different. In fact, some Japanese people had actually come to the Philippines in some of the islands to live with the Filipinos. And they shared fishing techniques. They were very harmonious in the villages. When the Japanese army came in and started to abuse the Filipinos, the Japanese people came to the army and said, "What are you doing? These are our friends. We've grown up with these people." The Japanese said, "So you don't like the way we're treating them?" And they said, "No." So they gathered all the Japanese people together and executed them.
Oh my, how terrible.
And that was a clear signal. If you're Japanese and you're in the Philippines, you don't interfere.
Don't interfere with
Not with the military.
With the military.
You do not interfere. So no one did, or if they did it at great risk to their lives.
Well, you know, when you were mentioning that they took these men, they were able-bodied, and shipped them to Japan to work in the factories because there were no men. Well, they were kamikazes. They were killing themselves, dive bombing on the ships out at sea or wherever. There was no return for them to come back. It was a one-time shot, and that was the end of it.
Well, that's one of the things Yamamoto had pointed out. He said, not only is their industrial capacity far superior to ours, they have far more people. So they can raise an army of 5 million. We can't do that. So
in a heartbeat,
the whole strategy was to knock out, deliver a crippling blow to the British, the French, the Australians, and the Americans, so that they couldn't recover from it. And that was their strategy. Yamamoto tried his best, but he knew in the end it was a losing prospect.
Did he die of natural causes?
No, he was killed in the war.
He was killed. I was wondering maybe he committed
He was on a plane, and they just bad luck. Or good luck, depending on how you look at it. They got him. They got him.
Look at that.
Yeah. So most of the people the Japanese High Command was tried for war crimes because of what they did to the conquered people. And MacArthur, at the surrender, did something. He knew Japan. He knew the Asian culture. And he did something very, I think, incredibly honorable and wise. Had he had the Japanese surrender on Japanese soil, it would have been a mark of shame that would have created a lot of difficulty in the occupation and getting the Japanese to work with the occupation. So he had Yamamoto sign on the Missouri, American territory. So there was no shame for him that he had signed on Japanese territory. The other thing is, if anyone ever believed that it wasn't necessary to drop the hydrogen bomb or the atomic bomb on Japan, all they have to do is study the Philippine War.
Oh, how tragic.
It just, or Okinawa,
that
because
was really bad.
the Japanese would have fought to the absolute last person.
Well, I'm telling you, I think it was I think it may have been in the 1990s. We're already 2017, but that they found these guys in caves. They didn't know who they were.
No.
They were old men, but they still were fighting. They would come out to fight.
It's a way of life.
They didn't believe the war was over, and they were going to fight for their honor of the emperor.
And that was so different from the American way of thinking that it was very difficult for the two to understand each other.
The emperor to the Japanese people was like a god. You need to obey what they said.
Until the emperor broadcast that the war was over, most Japanese had never even heard his voice.
But they were pledged to whatever his...
Pledged to the idea that the emperor was watching over them and that they owed complete allegiance to him. But they hadn't even heard his voice. It was the first time most of them had, they were a little surprised because it was a little high-pitched and it didn't sound like an impressive emperor.
Are there any recordings?
Yes.
Do we have recordings?
Oh, yes.
It would be wire recordings.
Yes.
That was at the time.
Yeah, they have them
to
recorded.
hear what that sounded like.
Oh, yeah, that was recorded. And a lot of the other speeches at that time were recorded as well. So there's a good audio record of this.
This brings to mind, we don't have much time, but this brings to mind like there was a picture on TV in the 50s. It was called Victory at Sea.
Yeah.
And I think it was every Friday night you'd get a half hour or an hour of this. And I was watching those, aircraft carriers, and in my mind I could hear da 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 da.
Richard Rogers.
We have the record.
Tremendous.
It's just incredible.
Yeah, it's one of, to really understand what war is like, we don't really know what it's like unless you've been in it. To really understand it, you have to understand what it sounds like and what it smells like.
The sounds and smells.
Now, movies can give you a great idea of the sounds and sights. They cannot possibly give you a sense of what it smells like.
What the smell is, yeah.
If people could smell it,
the napalm,
nobody would go to war.
The napalm, the burning, terrible.
It's just something you can't convey unless you're there. And once you smell it, it's like the smell of rotting flesh. Once you smell it, you don't ever forget it.
You don't forget that.
No. So here they had this incredible stench of war around them all the time.
We must remember our patriots and our veterans. And again, let me remind you that it was called Armistice Day, but now we call it Veterans Day. It was the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day. And so we need to remember our patriots and our veterans. Please put out a flag. Please show your loyalty and your honor to our country, America, and to those who fought and gave the ultimate sacrifice so that we may be free and free other countries as well of the danger of war So it's really Saturday. That would be November the 11th, and it will be this whole weekend that it will be celebrated. And I think the 13th is also considered a celebration day or remembrance day.
It might be, yeah.
For the
so.
veterans. So regardless, put out an American flag. We are Americans. Here's our flag. And you can see our program on YouTube. There we are down below. Here we are. And we encourage you and invite you to watch our program. And I hope that you enjoy this program. I hope that you learn something from this program. We have a real live family member who both grandfather and father served as code breakers for the Americans and the Allies to break the code of the Japanese. And she came here, Sue, to tell the story of her family, a great patriotic family. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And
I hope everyone out there really appreciates
I
what
hope
it
that
takes.
you all do appreciate what Sue's family went through, and
So many.
that little, tickle in her heart. Every time, this is the second time I heard this and I saw it, she had to stop.
I never can make it through it without crying.
To regain her composure, because it's very difficult. So I hope that we have brought some, information to you and educated you, and that this program means to you as much as it means to us. We have patriots and veterans in our family, and both military combat veterans. So thank you for watching and allowing us in your home or your place of business. Have a pleasant week, have a safe weekend, and a pleasant evening. See you next week on North Shore Live, Cooper's Corner. Please do hang out a flag for Veterans Day, November the 11th. God bless you all, and thank you for watching. Have a good evening.